At 76, King Charles finally said the one thing he'd kept buried for decades. And it wasn't what the world expected. There was no press conference, no media buildup, just a hushed statement in an intimate royal gathering, whispered under his breath, yet loud enough to shift the ground beneath the monarchy. Those in the room froze. The words were simple, even soft, but their weight could crush decades of silence, regret, and buried truths. He spoke not of his reign, his legacy, or the crown, but of love. A love that never got to breathe freely. A love that still haunted him. Within hours, leaks trickled out. And then, a single phrase echoed across headlines around the world. She was the love I lost before I even had a chance to hold on. The world paused. Who was she? Was it Camilla, the woman who now sat at his side, crowned and accepted by the royal court after years of controversy? Was it Diana, the radiant people's princess, whose memory still bathed the monarchy in a sorrow it could never quite wash away? Or was it someone else entirely? A ghost from the past the public never knew? Within minutes, the British press erupted. Old flames were re-examined, paparazzi dug through photo archives, palace aides dodged questions. The mystery wasn't just about a name, it was about a history long rewritten by royal duty and media spectacle. Every network speculated, every talk show debated. Was this Charles's long-awaited act of closure, or was it a last confession from a man running out of time? Royal watchers, analysts, and historians scrambled to make sense of the puzzle. But this wasn't a puzzle built with facts. It was built with heartbreak, and only Charles held the missing piece. As headlines spun and theories swirled, something deeper began to stir, an awakening of old wounds. Because this confession didn't just expose a name, it reopened the most fragile, tragic, and human story behind Britain's most guarded institution. Behind every crown is a cost. Behind every royal smile, a sacrifice. And for Charles, this sacrifice had always been personal. It wasn't just about tradition or reputation. It was about letting go of someone he never truly wanted to lose. For decades, he'd followed the script handed to him by the monarchy. He'd smiled through heartbreak, stood tall through scandal, and played his part in a royal drama written by everyone but him. Until now. And suddenly, the world wasn't looking at King Charles III, the ruler. They were looking at Charles, the man. The boy raised in a palace without affection. The teenager burdened with titles before he ever felt freedom. The adult forced to choose between love and legacy. This confession cracked open the gilded facade, revealing a story no one was ready for. A story not of kings and queens, but of quiet yearning and brutal choices. To understand the weight of his words, we must go back to the beginning, before the crown, before the scandals. Charles was born a prince, but raised in a prison of expectations. From the moment he took his first breath inside the gilded walls of Buckingham Palace, his life was no longer his own. He wasn't cradled like other children, not in the warmth of unconditional love, but in the cold arms of royal tradition. Affection was offered in measured doses, emotions tightly sealed behind centuries of protocol. His parents, bound by duty, offered little room for tenderness. Queen Elizabeth was the sovereign, not just a mother. And Prince Philip, demanding and stoic, believed in hardening his son rather than holding him. Charles's earliest memories weren't of playground laughter or bedtime stories. They were of eyes watching, hands directing, voices correcting. Even as a boy, he belonged more to the institution than to himself. There were no messy emotions allowed in the palace, only rehearsed smiles and silent obedience. By the time Charles was old enough to understand what love should feel like, he'd already learned how to hide it. The household ran like a well-oiled machine, one that didn't pause for the soft needs of a child. And when Charles was sent to Gordonstoun, the elite but punishing Scottish boarding school, it wasn't an escape, it was exile. The school's brutal emphasis on toughness crushed his spirit further. He was mocked for his sensitivity, bullied for being the heir, and worst of all, ignored when he needed support the most. His letters home often went unanswered, his tears unseen. In those long, cold corridors, the boy who would be king learned to mask his pain with silence. But it wasn't just school that shaped him. It was the entire royal system. Every move Charles made, how he stood, what he said, even how he laughed was dissected, judged, and measured against an invisible standard. Royal life didn't reward authenticity, it punished it. Vulnerability was weakness. Feeling was failure. So Charles adapted. He became quiet, measured, almost mechanical in his public appearances. He shook hands like he was trained, smiled when cameras clicked, and bowed, even when what he truly wanted was to scream. Inside, he was still a boy aching to be seen, not as a future monarch, but as a human being. That aching need for connection never left him. It grew stronger with age. Under the surface of polished public appearances was a man searching for something he'd never known. Someone who would look at him without seeing the crown. Someone who would listen, not because of his title, but because they cared. The more he was told to follow duty, the more he dreamed of freedom. And behind the golden facade of royal life, he longed for something far more powerful than power itself, genuine love. Not arranged affection or ceremonial admiration, but real, soul-deep love. A love that didn't ask him to pretend. A love that didn't come with conditions or consequences. And then, amidst this cold upbringing, Charles met someone who made him feel truly alive. For the first time, Charles didn't feel like a prince, he felt human. It happened unexpectedly, without fanfare or planning, during a polo match in the early 1970s. There, among the predictable rituals of royal life, stood Camilla Shand. She wasn't a princess, wasn't rehearsed, wasn't trying to impress him. She simply spoke to him as a man. She laughed freely, teased him playfully, and didn't flinch when he mentioned the suffocating expectations he lived under. There was no protocol between them, no rank, no ceremony, just two souls meeting in a rare, unfiltered moment. For Charles, it was electric. She saw past the titles and polished exterior and made him feel something he'd never truly experienced before: acceptance. Their connection deepened fast. They spent hours talking, their conversations veering from royal frustrations to poetry, politics, and everything in between. Camilla wasn't intimidated by Charles's position. She challenged him, comforted him, made him feel alive in a way palace walls never had. Around her, he shed the rigid script of his role and stepped into something unfamiliar but deeply desired: his own identity. It wasn't just love, it was liberation. She reminded him he was more than a ceremonial figure, more than a headline. She made him believe he was worth loving, not as a future king, but as a man with flaws, fears, and unspoken dreams. But their joy didn't go unnoticed. Whispers began circulating within the palace. Advisors, courtiers, and family members watched with growing concern. Camilla, in their eyes, was a threat not because of anything she did, but because of everything she wasn't. She didn't come from noble lineage. She didn't have the right pedigree. And worst of all, she didn't play the game. To the royal machinery that made her unsuitable, unfit, dangerous. Charles, still young and uncertain in his position, was warned repeatedly and sternly. If he continued the relationship, it would cost him the crown. He was told to step away, to wait, to let it pass. But love doesn't respond to commands. It clings, even when forbidden. As their relationship deepened, the pressure intensified. Eventually, Charles was sent away on a long naval tour, convenient timing, that conveniently removed him from Camilla's life. While he was gone, the unthinkable happened. Camilla, under her own pressures and perhaps out of resignation, accepted a proposal from her former flame, Andrew Parker Bowles. The marriage was swift and public, and when Charles returned, it was already too late. She was gone not from his heart, but from his reach. He was gutted. The one person who made him feel real had slipped away, not because their love had faded, but because duty had stolen her. He buried the pain like he'd been taught to bury everything else. He resumed his royal appearances, smiled on command, and told the press he was fine. But inside, the loss gnawed at him. He didn't stop loving her. He simply stopped showing it. It was the beginning of a pattern that would define his most intimate decisions, choosing silence over rebellion, image over desire, and role over self. The love was real, and it remained, buried beneath layers of royal obligation. A fire forced, underground, still burning quietly. But the crown demanded more. A different woman was chosen, one who could fit the fairy tale. Their wedding was watched by the world, but love wasn't part of the script. On July 29, 1981, nearly 1 billion people tuned in to witness what was branded as the wedding of the century. A shy, soft-spoken 20-year-old Diana Spencer walked into St. Paul's Cathedral, draped in a gown that took the breath of the world. She looked every bit the fairy tale princess. And beside her stood Charles, future King of England, composed, regal, and rehearsed. To the outside world, it was the perfect match: beauty, grace, youth paired with tradition, power, and monarchy. But beneath the veil of pageantry, something vital was missing. Something no camera could capture. There was no bond, no spark, no emotional rhythm between them. It wasn't just a mismatch, it was a masquerade. Diana had been chosen, not loved. Handpicked by royal advisors, approved by palace aides, and celebrated by a media machine desperate for a new chapter in the royal fairy tale. She checked every box. Aristocratic lineage, public charm, naive enough to be molded, and, importantly, untouched by scandal. She was the ideal royal bride, but not the woman Charles's heart belonged to. Even on the eve of their wedding, Diana had second thoughts. She sensed something wasn't right. She'd seen a bracelet Charles had commissioned for Camilla. She'd overheard conversations no bride should hear. But the momentum was too great, the expectations too crushing. So she smiled, walked down the aisle, and stepped into a role that would slowly devour her. From the very beginning, the cracks were visible to those who looked closely. Diana was open, emotional, hungry for connection. Charles was reserved, emotionally trained to deflect. She sought warmth. He offered duty. The moments that should have drawn them closer only highlighted how far apart they were. Behind palace doors, Diana's laughter turned into quiet tears. Charles, meanwhile, retreated further into his shell, burying himself in engagements, speeches, and tradition. And always, lingering in the backdrop, was Camilla, a shadow that stretched into every corner of their marriage. Diana could feel it. Her instincts were sharp, and the presence of another woman, though rarely acknowledged aloud, was undeniable in the way Charles averted his eyes, diverted his affections, and clung to the comfort of the one person who had once made him feel whole. The turning point came, not behind closed doors, but in front of a camera. During a now infamous interview, Diana said the words that pierced the royal facade. "There were 3 of us in this marriage. It was bold, devastating, and true." That single sentence shifted public perception forever. The fairy tale crumbled into something far more complicated and painfully human. Diana's courage in voicing what so many suspected cracked open the sealed vault of royal secrecy. And while the world watched her with sympathy and awe, Charles stayed silent. He didn't fight her words. He didn't correct them. Because deep down, he knew she wasn't wrong. But while Diana spoke out, Charles stayed silent until his heart quietly betrayed him again. The affair that rocked a nation didn't start with betrayal. It started with loneliness. By the late 1980s, Charles and Diana's marriage had become a fragile performance, 2 strangers sharing the same stage, smiling for cameras while barely speaking behind the scenes. They had drifted into separate orbits, bound by duty, but starved of intimacy. The fairy tale was already unraveling, quietly and painfully. And in the silence of that emotional void, Charles turned to the one person who had always made him feel understood. Camilla. What began as secret letters and guarded meetings soon reignited into something far more dangerous. Their bond, still burning beneath the ashes, had never truly died. But this time, the stakes were immeasurably higher. They weren't just rekindling a romance, they were stepping into the eye of a storm. Both were married. Both had reputations, families, and obligations. But the heart doesn't heed consequences. The more isolated Charles felt in his marriage, the more he leaned into Camilla. And for a while, they managed to keep their connection hidden, protected by silence and carefully controlled appearances. But secrets, especially royal ones, don't stay buried for long. In 1993, a private phone call between Charles and Camilla was leaked to the press. The conversation, deeply intimate, shockingly personal, and later dubbed Tampongate, sent the nation into a frenzy. Overnight, their hidden love became a national scandal. Jokes spread like wildfire. Headlines exploded with mockery and disgust. And just like that, the carefully preserved dignity of the monarchy shattered under the weight of human desire. While Charles faced a media onslaught, Diana's quiet suffering erupted into something raw and visible. She was no longer just a princess. She was a symbol of heartbreak. Her emotional breakdowns grew harder to hide. Her struggle, once confined to palace walls, spilled into public view. And the people saw her pain. They saw the tears, the loneliness, the betrayal, and they rallied behind her. Public sympathy swelled. Diana became the wounded heroine in a tragedy that had once been a love story. And Charles, once the nation's golden heir, became the villain of the crown's most intimate scandal. In 1994, the pressure mounted to a breaking point. Charles, in a television interview meant to mend his image, made a staggering admission he had been unfaithful. He didn't deny the affair. He didn't shield himself with excuses. Instead, he stood before the nation and confirmed what they already suspected, that his heart had not belonged to his wife for a very long time. The backlash was swift and brutal. His approval ratings plummeted. The monarchy, an institution built on image, tradition, and restraint, now found itself tainted by very human flaws. Adultery, deception, emotional collapse, this was no longer a royal narrative. It was a scandal worthy of tabloids, not thrones. But even as the world condemned him, Charles made a choice. He would never let Camilla go again. Diana's death didn't just shake the world. It shattered Charles. In the early hours of August 31, 1997, a single phone call brought news that would forever change the course of royal history. Diana, the woman the world had come to love more than the crown itself, had died in a car crash in Paris. The reaction was instant and overwhelming. Streets filled with mourners. Mountains of flowers piled outside Kensington Palace. A nation went into mourning not for a princess, but for a woman who had shown them what royalty could be when it dared to be human. And in the silence that followed the shock, one question rang louder than the rest. Where was Charles? He had never seemed so distant, so hesitant, so painfully unsure of how to react. But behind closed doors, he was a man completely undone. The woman he once stood beside, not always kindly, not always faithfully, was gone. And with her passing, every unspoken apology, every unresolved emotion, every chance to make things right, vanished too. Charles wasn't just mourning Diana. He was mourning his own failure, the years he had spent emotionally removed, the choices he had made, the silence he had allowed to speak for him. All came crashing down in the wake of her death. Her absence became a mirror, reflecting everything he had refused to face. As Diana's image grew into legend, Charles was cast deeper into shadow. The people didn't just grieve, they blamed. They looked at Charles not as a widower, but as the man who had broken her spirit. And beside him, the woman they had never forgiven, Camilla, became the lightning rod for decades of resentment. The public, still raw with grief, turned their fury toward her. Editorials called her unworthy. Protesters demanded she be cast out. She wasn't just the other woman anymore, she was the villain in a tragedy too painful to ignore. To calm the storm, Camilla withdrew. No appearances, no statements, no defense. She vanished from view, as if the palace had locked her behind a curtain, hoping the outrage would pass. Meanwhile, Charles faced his harshest reckoning yet. For the first time in his life, his royal title couldn't shield him from consequence. Approval ratings collapsed. His public engagements drew icy stares, And inside the palace, advisors quietly questioned whether he had any chance of regaining the trust of the people. But for Charles, the pain went far beyond reputation. He had loved Camilla. He had once tried to love Diana. And now, with one lost forever and the other under siege, he stood in the wreckage of both relationships, unsure of how to move forward. The guilt was suffocating. The regret, impossible to silence. He had traded emotional honesty for royal survival, and in the end, it had cost him both. But behind the palace walls, love continued to bloom, and Charles began his slow redemption. The woman once blamed for a nation's heartbreak was now being called Queen. For years, Camilla had been a silent figure in the background of royal life, tolerated at best, vilified at worst. To many, she was the shadow that haunted Diana's every step. But in the years following Diana's death, something unthinkable began to happen. Slowly, strategically, and with an almost surgical precision, Charles began to reintroduce Camilla to the public, not as a scandal, but as a partner. The process wasn't fast, it wasn't flashy, but it was deliberate. Every step was calculated to change perception, and gradually, it worked. Their appearances together were brief at first: charity events, mutual friends parties, low-profile outings where they barely touched. But each sighting sent a message. She was still here, and he wasn't letting go. Then came the pivot. Camilla began embracing a different kind of spotlight. She championed causes quiet, personal ones like osteoporosis awareness, something close to her heart due to her mother's suffering. She stepped into the role of a royal consort, not through entitlement, but through service. No grandstanding, no demands, just consistency, authenticity, humility, and in time, the public began to notice.